At 6:59 on the morning of February 11, 1944, in a shallow ravine 2 kilometers east of the village of Veliki Krashinci, Vinnytsia Oblast, a single M4A2 Sherman burned quietly in the snow. The diesel engine was not running. The turret was locked at 11 o'clock. Steam drifted from a split radiator hose and froze as it fell. 30 meters upslope, Wehrmacht Panzergrenadiers lay prone along a hedgerow, rifles ready, waiting for the crew inside the immobilized tank to abandon it. Further back, unseen through the fog, a StuG E3 StuG idled with its engine at low revolutions, gun already laid on the ravine. Inside the Sherman, Red Army Mechanic Senior Sergeant Ivan Petrovich Sokolov counted the seconds by the sound of his own breath and realized, with absolute clarity, that if the engine started now, the Germans would die, and if it did not, everyone inside the tank would. How did this happen? By early February 1944, the southwestern sector of the Eastern Front had entered a dangerous pause. The Red Army was pushing west after the winter offensives, but the momentum was uneven. The 1st Guards Tank Army, advancing through central Ukraine, was stretched thin by terrain and weather. The rasputitsa had not fully arrived, but repeated thaws followed by sudden freezes turned roads into alternating layers of mud and ice. Fields that looked solid at dawn swallowed vehicles by midday. Forest belts and shallow ravines cut the land into compartments that favored German mobile defense. Villages of low wooden houses and collective farm buildings became anchor points for ambushes. Rivers were choked with ice too weak to carry tanks, forcing units onto predictable crossings. German forces in the sector relied on delaying actions. Panzergrenadier battalions, supported by assault guns and pack anti-tank guns, withdrew by bounds, striking at exposed Soviet spearheads. They avoided large engagements, preferring to let weather and mechanical failure do part of the work. Soviet tank units, operating far ahead of their repair echelons, paid for every kilometer with broken suspensions, frozen fuel lines, and engines that refused to turn over after a night in the open. The Sherman was both a blessing and a problem. The M4A2 diesel variant, delivered under Lend-Lease, was valued by Soviet crews for its reliability compared to gasoline models and for the reduced fire risk of diesel fuel. But it was still a foreign machine. Its systems behaved differently in extreme cold. Fuel pumps froze. Oil thickened despite winter grades. Electrical systems suffered when moisture condensed and refroze. Field manuals existed, but experience mattered more than paper. Senior Sergeant Ivan Petrovich Sokolov was 32 years old in February 1944. He served as assistant driver mechanic in the 44th Guards Tank Brigade of the 1st Guards Tank Army. He had grown up in a village outside Tula, son of a blacksmith. Before the war, he worked at a tractor repair station, where engines arrived abused and left running because there was no alternative. He was conscripted in 1941, trained on T-34s, and transferred to Shermans in late 1943. He trusted machines, but he did not trust weather. Cold frightened him more than shells, because cold killed without noise. The crew of his Sherman had been on the move for 3 days with minimal maintenance. On the night of February 10, temperatures dropped sharply to -18 degrees Celsius. The tank was parked in a low area to avoid observation, but the ravine trapped cold air. The engine was shut down at 22:30 to conserve fuel. There was no shelter. At 5:40, Sokolov attempted the first start. The starter motor engaged sluggishly, then stopped. Oil pressure did not rise. The engine did not turn. By 6:05, he knew the problem was layered. The oil had congealed despite dilution. The fuel pump was cold-soaked. Condensation in the electrical contacts had frozen. Each issue alone was manageable. Together, under enemy pressure, they were lethal. The tank commander ordered another attempt. The starter groaned, then failed completely. The solenoid clicked once and went silent. Sokolov reported the failure calmly, but he could hear movement outside the ravine. At 6:18, rifle shots cracked somewhere to the north. At 6:27, the radio operator intercepted German voices on a nearby frequency. The enemy was close. The crew debated abandoning the tank. Doctrine discouraged it, but doctrine assumed mobility. Sokolov argued for time. He asked for 10 minutes. He did not explain how he would fix it. He did not know yet. He only knew that if they stepped out into the snow, the Germans would see them immediately. At 6:34, a mortar round landed on the far slope, showering the ravine with frozen dirt. The Sherman shuddered. A fragment cut a control cable in the turret basket. The commander shouted to hurry. Sokolov opened the engine access panel. Cold air poured in, biting his face. The smell of diesel was thick. He touched the fuel pump housing. It was like iron from a freezer. He tried to turn the pump shaft by hand. It did not move. He had seen this before, once, during training. A frozen pump could be coaxed into motion if warmed unevenly, but there was no heater. No time to build a fire. No spare parts. What he did have was engine oil, rags, and a battery with some charge left. At 6:42, as German infantry began moving down toward the ravine, Sokolov made a decision that would later be described in a maintenance log with a single line crossed out in pencil. He disconnected the fuel pump line and deliberately allowed a small amount of diesel to spill onto the frozen housing. He soaked a rag in oil, wrapped it around the pump, and connected it briefly to the battery, using the resistance of the soaked cloth to generate heat. It was dangerous. Sparks near fuel vapor could kill them all. The commander protested. The driver swore. The radio operator went silent. Sokolov counted under his breath. Not to 10. To 30. At 28, the rag began to smoke. At 32, he pulled it free. The pump housing was no longer dead cold. He struck it lightly with a wrench. Once. Twice. The shaft moved a fraction. At that moment, a German voice called out from the edge of the ravine. Boots crunched closer. Sokolov reconnected the line, closed the panel, and shouted to try the starter. The engine did not start. It coughed. In that single cough lay the beginning of a trap that none of the men in the ravine could yet see. The engine cough at 6:59 did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of fear. A diesel that coughed once and failed was worse than one that did nothing at all, because it meant the system was awake enough to betray them. Sound carried far in cold air. Somewhere above the ravine, German ears would have caught it. Inside the Sherman, breath hung in pale clouds. Condensation formed instantly on metal surfaces and froze again. The driver held the starter switch, waiting for the signal. The commander listened to the exterior through his headset, one gloved hand resting on the turret ring as if he could feel the ground through steel. Sokolov crouched over the open engine compartment, fingers already numb despite wool liners under his gloves. The cough had confirmed his suspicion. The fuel pump was no longer solidly frozen, but oil pressure was still too low for sustained rotation. The oil in the crankcase had thickened into something closer to grease than liquid. Under normal conditions, the M4A2's diesel would tolerate abuse, but cold changed tolerances. Bearings starved first. Then pistons seized. If they forced the engine now, they could destroy it permanently. Outside, German Panzergrenadiers advanced cautiously. They were not rushing. Experience told them that an immobilized Soviet tank was most dangerous just before it died. Two men moved to the left, using a fold in the ground. Another pair covered them, rifles trained on the dark rectangle of the ravine. Further back, the StuG commander waited. His orders were clear: let the infantry draw fire, then finish the tank. At 7:03, a German mortar fired again. The round landed short, but fragments rang against the Sherman's hull. One struck the rear deck, denting the thin armor above the engine. The sound echoed inside like a hammer blow. The radio operator flinched and reported movement to the west. The commander asked Sokolov for a time estimate. Sokolov did not answer immediately. He was listening to the engine. Not to sound, but to resistance. He placed his hand on the starter motor casing. It was slightly warmer now. That meant current had flowed. That meant the battery still had life. But not much. Every attempt drained it further. He remembered an old trick from the tractor station near Tula. In winter, when engines refused to turn, mechanics would thin oil locally, not by replacing it, but by heating specific points to create channels. It was crude. It violated every manual. It worked often enough to matter. He ordered the driver to disengage the starter. He reached for a metal cup, filled it with engine oil, and placed it near the exhaust manifold. The manifold was cold now, but it retained heat longer than other components. He used his hands to warm the oil slightly, pressing the cup against his chest. It was not enough, but it was something. At 7:08, German voices were clearly audible. Words were indistinct, but tone carried intent. The Panzergrenadiers believed the tank was dead. They were preparing to rush it with grenades. Sokolov removed the oil filler cap and poured a small amount of warmed oil directly onto the exposed rocker assembly. The oil moved slowly, reluctantly, then disappeared into darkness. He waited 5 seconds. He poured again. Each pour was a gamble. Too much, and the oil would simply thicken again. Too little, and nothing would change. The commander hissed for speed. The gunner reported shapes moving on the right flank. The Sherman's main gun was loaded, but without engine power, the turret traverse was limited. Manual rotation was slow and exhausting. If the Germans closed to within 20 meters, it would be too late. At 7:11, Sokolov made the second dangerous decision of the morning. He ordered the battery disconnected from non-essential systems. The radio went dark. Interior lights died. Only the starter circuit remained. He took a wrench and struck the starter motor housing sharply, 3 times. Not hard enough to crack it. Hard enough to jar internal components loose. He signaled the driver. The starter engaged with a grinding noise that sent a spike of pain through Sokolov's jaw. The engine turned a quarter rotation. Oil pressure needle twitched, then dropped. The engine stopped. The commander swore softly. Outside, a German shouted something urgent. A grenade clinked against the ravine wall and rolled down, stopping 10 meters short of the hull. Sokolov raised his voice for the first time. He told them to wait. He told them that if the engine started now, they must not move. The commander stared at him, incredulous. Movement was life. Stillness was death. Sokolov explained quickly. The Germans expected a breakout or an abandonment. They had positioned themselves accordingly. If the engine started and the tank did nothing, even for a few seconds, the Germans would hesitate. That hesitation could be shaped. At 7:14, he reopened the engine panel. Cold air rushed in again. He removed the fan belt entirely. The commander protested, but Sokolov ignored him. A snapped belt would end everything. A removed belt changed the problem. Without the fan load, the engine would turn more easily. Cooling would be irrelevant for the first critical minute. He signaled again. The starter engaged. The engine turned. Once. Twice. On the third rotation, it fired unevenly, then caught. The sound was wrong, uneven, coughing, metal protesting metal, but it was unmistakably alive. At 7:15, the M4A2 Sherman's engine was running at low revolutions in a frozen ravine east of Veliki Krashinsky. Outside, the effect was immediate. German movement stopped. Shouts cut off mid-word. The Panzergrenadiers dropped back instinctively, unsure whether the tank would surge forward or fire. The StuG commander ordered his gunner to stand by, but did not fire yet. A moving target was harder to hit in close terrain. Inside the Sherman, Sokolov raised one finger. He told the driver to hold the engine at idle. Not higher. Not yet. Oil pressure climbed slowly, painfully slowly, but it climbed. Channels were opening. Bearings were surviving. At 7:17, the Germans adjusted. One squad began to move wide, toward the rear of the ravine. They intended to circle and attack from behind, where the engine noise was loudest. Sokolov watched the oil pressure gauge and made his final calculation. If they moved now, the engine might stall under load. If they waited too long, the Germans would reach the rear deck. He leaned toward the commander and spoke quietly. He told him that the tank was not merely alive. It was bait. If they stayed where they were, if they let the Germans commit fully to closing in, the narrow ravine would do the rest. The Germans would bunch. They would expose themselves. And when the engine was ready, not before, not after, the Sherman would become a weapon again. At 7:18, the engine note steadied. Oil pressure reached a level Sokolov had never been so grateful to see. He replaced the fan belt with shaking hands, fingers barely obeying him. He closed the engine panel. Outside, boots crunched closer again. The Germans had decided. The tank was damaged, but not dead. That made it dangerous. Dangerous things had to be finished quickly. Inside, Sokolov nodded once. The trap was set. At 7:19, the commander relayed a brief transmission to brigade headquarters before the radio was cut again. He did not explain. He only gave coordinates and reported engine recovered, enemy infantry close. It was enough to place the moment in a logbook somewhere far to the rear. No reply came. None was expected. Inside the Sherman, every man understood the balance they were holding. The engine was alive, but fragile. The oil was still thick in places, circulation uneven. Any sudden increase in revolutions could shear a bearing or snap the temporarily refitted fan belt. Sokolov crouched with one hand on the engine bulkhead, feeling vibration through steel. He listened not for sound, but for rhythm. Diesels spoke in patterns. Right now, the pattern was strained but coherent. Outside, the German Panzergrenadiers resumed movement with more caution than before. They advanced in short bounds, one element moving while another covered. Their assumption had shifted. This was no longer an abandoned vehicle. It was a wounded one, and wounded machines sometimes lashed out. At 7:22, the first German rifle shot struck the Sherman's hull, a testing shot, aimed low. It rang sharply and ricocheted into the snow. The gunner inside tightened his grip on the traverse handwheel. Manual rotation was slow, but possible. He tracked the sound rather than the sight. The ravine constrained everything. It was narrow, no more than 40 meters across at its widest, with sloping sides crusted in snow and frozen mud. Any infantry advancing inside it had limited cover. The Germans knew this, but they also knew the tank could not elevate its gun sufficiently to hit targets close to the hull without exposing weak armor angles. At 7:25, Sokolov noticed a change in engine vibration. Subtle, but there. The rhythm smoothed slightly. Oil was reaching places it had not minutes before. He tapped the driver's shoulder twice, the agreed signal. The driver raised revolutions by a fraction. The engine protested, then accepted it. The commander watched through his periscope. He saw movement on the left slope. 3 German figures, bent low, using the ground to mask their approach. He ordered the gunner to prepare a canister round. Ammunition was limited, but at this range, canister would be devastating. At 7:27, a German grenade landed closer this time, sliding down the ravine wall and detonating against the Sherman's track. The explosion was muffled by snow, but fragments tore through the outer road wheel rubber. The track held. Barely. The Germans were close now. Too close for comfort. The StuG remained silent, its commander unwilling to risk firing into his own infantry. That hesitation was exactly what Sokolov had hoped for, though he would never have framed it that way. He thought only in mechanical margins. At 7:29, the engine temperature gauge began to rise. Without full cooling, heat accumulated quickly. The window was narrowing. They could not remain stationary much longer. The commander made eye contact with Sokolov. No words were exchanged. Sokolov nodded once. Not yet. Almost. Outside, the Panzergrenadiers committed. A squad broke from cover and rushed down the ravine, rifles up, intent on reaching the rear deck. They were no longer cautious. They believed speed would save them. At 7:31, Sokolov gave the signal. The driver increased revolutions sharply, just for a moment. The engine roared, uneven but powerful. The sudden noise echoed in the ravine, magnified by the frozen walls. The Sherman lurched forward half a meter, then stopped deliberately. Snow and mud churned under the tracks, spraying outward. The effect on the Germans was immediate and catastrophic. The charging squad froze instinctively, some dropping prone, others stumbling as the ground shifted under them. In that instant of confusion, the commander ordered fire. The main gun fired canister at point-blank range. The blast filled the ravine with metal fragments and smoke. The effect was brutal and final. Where there had been movement, there was now only disturbed snow and silence. At 7:32, the machine gun joined in, raking the slopes where other German elements were attempting to reposition. The narrow terrain amplified the killing power. There was nowhere to disperse. The StuG commander reacted too late. He ordered his gunner to fire, but the angle was poor. The first round struck the ravine wall above the Sherman, showering it with debris but causing no damage. The second shot was delayed as the assault gun repositioned. Sokolov felt the engine strain under load as the driver began to maneuver more aggressively. He shouted to reduce speed. The commander overruled him, ordering a pivot to bring the frontal armor toward the StuG's likely position. At 7:34, the Sherman turned, tracks grinding. The damaged road wheel screamed under stress. The engine temperature spiked. For a moment, Sokolov thought it would stall again. He braced himself, hand on the bulkhead, ready to signal shutdown if necessary. The engine held. The pivot brought the Sherman's gun to bear on the ravine exit. Smoke and fog mixed, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. The Germans outside the ravine were now uncertain of the situation. Radio traffic crackled, confused, overlapping. At 7:36, the StuG fired again. The round struck the Sherman's glacis at an oblique angle and ricocheted upward, tearing away part of the periscope guard but failing to penetrate. Inside, the impact was deafening. The crew recoiled, then recovered. The commander ordered advance. Sokolov hesitated. This was the moment he had feared. Movement under sustained load could undo everything. But staying still would invite another direct hit. He made a choice he would later replay in memory without certainty. He signaled the driver to proceed slowly, maintaining revolutions within a narrow band. The driver obeyed, feathering the throttle with a delicacy born of terror. The Sherman climbed out of the ravine, engine roaring unevenly, tracks biting into frozen mud. German infantry scattered, some firing wildly, others running. The StuG attempted to reverse, but the terrain constrained it. At 7:38, the Sherman fired again, this time armor-piercing. The round struck the StuG's side armor at close range, penetrating. Smoke poured from the assault gun. Its engine died moments later. The ravine fell silent except for the Sherman's labored engine and the ticking of cooling metal. At 7:40, Sokolov ordered the engine reduced to idle. The immediate danger had passed, but the cost was not yet known. He watched the gauges with an intensity that blocked out everything else. Oil pressure dipped, then stabilized. Temperature began to fall slowly as airflow increased. They had survived the first act. Whether the engine would survive the next hour was still an open question. By 7:43, the immediate sounds of battle had receded, but the danger had not. Smoke hung low over the ravine and fields beyond, mixing with fog until distance lost meaning. The Sherman idled near the crest, engine uneven but alive. The crew did not celebrate. They waited. Experience had taught them that German doctrine favored rapid counteraction. Silence often meant repositioning. Sokolov moved again to the engine compartment, opening it only a fraction to avoid a sudden rush of cold air. Heat shimmered faintly above the block. The smell had changed, from raw diesel to hot oil and scorched paint. He checked the fan belt. It was holding, but the edges were fraying. It would not last long under sustained load. The commander scanned through his periscope. To the south, the fields were empty. To the west, beyond a line of bare trees, movement flickered, too distant to identify clearly. He suspected another Panzergrenadier element or possibly a pack gun being manhandled into position. The Germans would not abandon the area without attempting to recover initiative. At 7:46, the radio came back to life briefly as the operator reconnected power. A fragmented transmission came through, another tank from the brigade reporting contacts several kilometers north, also slowed by mechanical issues. The pattern was clear. The Germans were exploiting immobilization, not seeking decisive engagement. Sokolov listened with half an ear. His focus was on what could not be seen. The oil pressure needle wavered slightly with each change in engine tone. The improvised warming had bought them time, not reliability. He estimated perhaps 20 minutes of safe operation at low to moderate load. Beyond that, failure would return, possibly worse than before. The commander faced a decision. Doctrine urged momentum, pressing forward before the enemy could re-establish defense. Reality argued for caution. A disabled tank in open ground was a magnet for artillery. He chose a compromise. They would move to the edge of the nearby village, using buildings for cover, then reassess. At 7:50, the Sherman began to move again, slow and deliberate. The driver kept speed low, avoiding sudden turns. Each meter felt earned. The damaged road wheel protested, but the tracks stayed aligned. Mud clung to the links, adding weight with every rotation. German reaction came at 7:54. A pack gun fired from the tree line to the west. The round passed in front of the Sherman, missing by meters but confirming the presence of organized resistance. The commander ordered smoke deployment, but the launchers were frozen. Another reminder that cold degraded everything. Instead, the gunner fired a high-explosive round toward the muzzle flash. It was not aimed for destruction, but suppression. The explosion sent branches and snow into the air. The pack fell silent, at least temporarily. The village appeared ahead, low structures, roofs sagging under snow, fences half buried. The Sherman angled toward the nearest building cluster, using them as partial concealment. At 7:58, as the tank passed between two houses, the engine stumbled. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Sokolov felt it before he saw it. Vibration increased, rhythm faltered. The oil pressure dipped sharply, then recovered only partially. He shouted to the driver to reduce revolutions. The engine obeyed reluctantly, dropping to an uneven idle. They were still under threat. German infantry could be anywhere among the buildings. Stopping here was dangerous. Moving further might kill the engine outright. At 8:01, the commander ordered a halt behind a stone outbuilding, its wall thick enough to stop small arms fire and possibly fragments. The Sherman tucked in close, hull nearly touching stone. The engine was kept running, barely. Inside, the air was thick with exhaust fumes and sweat. Sokolov wiped his face with a sleeve stiff from frozen oil. He considered options. Repeating the earlier trick would be harder now. The engine was hot in places, cold in others. Uneven heating risked cracking components. He chose a different approach. He instructed the crew to prepare for a full shutdown, but only after specific steps. The commander hesitated, then agreed. Better a controlled stop than a catastrophic seizure. At 8:05, Sokolov gradually reduced revolutions while monitoring pressure. At the precise moment oil pressure reached its lowest stable point, he ordered shutdown. The engine died with a final shudder. Silence followed, heavy and ominous. They did not sit idle. Sokolov and the driver moved immediately. They drained a portion of oil into a container, thinning it by mixing with diesel in a ratio learned through bitter experience. It was dangerous, reducing lubrication quality, but it lowered viscosity enough to flow in cold channels. This was not a solution meant to last hours, only long enough to move again. Outside, German voices echoed faintly, carried by the wind. The enemy was probing the village, cautiously now. They had lost a platoon in the ravine. They would not repeat the same mistake blindly. At 8:12, with shaking hands, Sokolov poured the improvised mixture back into the engine. He resealed the cap and signaled readiness. The battery was weaker now. There might be only one attempt left. The commander ordered all hatches closed. The gunner reported movement between two houses across the square. The radio remained silent. They were alone, as far as immediate support was concerned. At 8:14, the starter engaged. The engine resisted, then turned. Once. Twice. On the third rotation, it fired unevenly, smoke pouring from the exhaust. Oil pressure climbed faster this time, though not to ideal levels. The gamble had worked, for now. The Sherman moved again at 8:16, edging out from behind the outbuilding, guns sweeping slowly. German infantry withdrew rather than press close. The psychological effect of the earlier ambush lingered. At 8:20, the commander received a brief radio message from brigade headquarters. Orders were simple: hold position until follow-on infantry arrived. Relief was hours away, but it meant they were no longer expected to push blindly forward. Sokolov allowed himself a single deep breath. The engine idled, strained but functional. The trap in the ravine had wiped out a Panzergrenadier platoon, but the cost was written in metal fatigue and borrowed time. He knew, with the certainty of a mechanic, that the story was not finished yet. The hours that followed were measured less by the clock than by sound. At 8:27, distant artillery rolled somewhere to the northwest, dull and irregular. At 8:41, rifle fire cracked briefly on the village edge, then faded. Each noise forced the crew into renewed stillness, listening for what came next. The Sherman remained behind the stone outbuilding, engine idling intermittently to preserve warmth without inviting attention. Sokolov managed the machine like a patient on borrowed blood. 5 minutes on. 3 minutes off. Each restart carried risk, but letting the block cool completely would be worse. The diluted oil flowed more easily now, but its protective margin was thin. Metal rubbed metal in places he could only imagine. At 8:53, the first Soviet infantry scouts appeared at the far end of the village. They moved cautiously, weapons ready, startled to find an American-built tank still alive in what should have been a German-controlled pocket. Recognition signals were exchanged. Relief was immediate but incomplete. Infantry support reduced close-range threats, but German armor was still unaccounted for beyond the tree line. The commander conferred briefly with the infantry lieutenant through an open hatch, voices low. The situation was clarified. German Panzergrenadiers had been delaying along a shallow defensive line, anchored by pack guns and supported by at least one remaining Panzer IV somewhere west of the village. The StuG destroyed in the ravine had been part of that screen. Its loss mattered. At 9:06, German artillery responded. Not heavy guns, but mortars. Rounds fell on the eastern edge of the village, then walked inward. The pattern was searching, not precise. Still, fragments rattled against roofs and walls. The Sherman was not directly targeted, but the risk of a lucky hit grew with every minute. Sokolov made another calculation. Stationary, the tank was a fixed point. Moving, it was vulnerable mechanically. He recommended relocation under infantry cover to a position with better hold-down potential near the village outskirts. The commander agreed. At 9:12, the Sherman moved again, crawling through narrow lanes, crushing fences and garden walls. The engine tone was rougher now, misfires audible even to untrained ears. Temperature remained marginal. Oil pressure fluctuated under load but stayed above the critical threshold Sokolov had marked in his mind. German resistance stiffened as they approached the village edge. At 9:18, a pack gun fired from concealment behind a haystack. The round struck the ground short, throwing mud and ice across the Sherman's glacis. Infantry responded immediately, pinning the gun crew with small arms fire. The Sherman added a high-explosive round. The haystack vanished in a bloom of smoke and debris. At 9:21, the engine faltered again. This time, it was more serious. The misfire became a stutter. Revolutions dropped unexpectedly. Oil pressure dipped dangerously low, then recovered partially. Sokolov shouted for immediate reduction in throttle. The driver complied, but momentum was lost. The tank slowed in open ground. German observers noticed. A Panzer IV Ausf, previously concealed behind a low rise beyond the trees, moved to engage. Its long-barreled gun tracked the Sherman as it struggled forward. At 9:23, the Panzer IV fired. The round struck the Sherman's turret side, penetrating the outer layer but failing to pass fully through. Spall wounded the loader, minor but bloody. The impact rocked the tank violently. Inside, chaos threatened. The commander ordered return fire. The gunner adjusted aim manually, breath fogging his sight. He fired armor-piercing. The round struck the Panzer IV's mantlet, ricocheting harmlessly. The situation tightened instantly. The Sherman was exposed, damaged, and under direct fire. Infantry could not close fast enough to neutralize the German tank. Retreat was limited by terrain. Forward movement depended entirely on an engine that was failing by degrees. Sokolov made the most dangerous decision of the day. He ordered the driver to increase revolutions beyond what he had previously allowed. The commander hesitated, then agreed. Survival now outweighed preservation. At 9:25, the engine roared, uneven and angry. The fan belt screamed under strain. Oil pressure spiked briefly, then dipped again. The smell of overheated oil filled the compartment. The Sherman surged forward, gaining speed just enough to shift position. The Panzer IV fired again. This time, the round struck the ground where the Sherman had been moments before, showering it with earth. At 9:26, the Sherman fired while moving. The gunner led instinctively, compensating for motion and angle. The armor-piercing round struck the Panzer IV's side armor at close range. Penetration was immediate. Smoke and flame erupted from the German tank's engine compartment. The Panzer IV stopped moving. The victory was immediate but fragile. As the Sherman slowed, the engine note changed catastrophically. A sharp crack echoed from the rear compartment. The fan belt snapped, whipping loose and striking metal. Temperature spiked instantly. Without cooling, heat built at a rate Sokolov knew well. Seconds mattered now, not minutes. He shouted for shutdown. At 9:28, the engine was cut. Silence fell again, broken only by distant gunfire and the hiss of cooling metal. Steam rose from the rear deck. The Sherman was alive no longer, but it had done its work. Sokolov slumped against the bulkhead, exhaustion crashing over him. His hands shook uncontrollably. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only the hollow aftermath of prolonged strain. Infantry secured the area quickly now. German resistance collapsed as word spread of lost armor and heavy infantry casualties. By 10:10, the village was firmly in Soviet hands. A recovery vehicle arrived hours later. The Sherman was towed to a field workshop. Examination confirmed Sokolov's fears. Bearings were scored. The cooling system was damaged beyond field repair. The engine would require replacement. In the logbook, the engagement was summarized in a few dry lines. Enemy infantry destroyed. 2 enemy armored vehicles knocked out. 1 M4A2 immobilized due to mechanical failure. What the logbook did not capture was the sequence of decisions, the thin margins, or the way a dead engine had shaped the movement of men and machines around it. The trap in the ravine had worked not because of doctrine, but because of desperation guided by mechanical understanding. The story was not finished yet, but its outcome was already sealed in steel and oil. The recovery crew reached the Sherman shortly after 1300 hours, moving carefully along a road that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. What had been a farm track was now a churned ribbon of mud, ice, and crushed snow, marked by tracks from tanks, half-tracks, and horse-drawn limbers. They worked without ceremony. By then, the tank was just another burden of steel to be moved, another entry in a repair queue that stretched all the way back to depots near the Dnieper. Sokolov stayed with the machine as it was winched forward. He watched the cables tighten, listened to the groan of stressed metal, and felt a peculiar sense of separation. The Sherman no longer belonged to him in the way it had that morning. It had crossed from weapon to object. From decision to consequence. At the forward workshop, mechanics confirmed what he already knew. The engine bearings showed heavy scoring. Oil galleries were fouled with sludge formed by the diesel dilution. The cooling system had suffered microfractures from uneven heating. The snapped fan belt had whipped through nearby wiring, damaging insulation. The verdict was final. Engine replacement. Days, not hours. A junior officer asked Sokolov to explain what he had done. The question was procedural, not curious. Sokolov answered plainly, step by step, without embellishment. He did not frame it as ingenuity. He framed it as necessity. The officer wrote briefly, paused, then crossed out a line and rewrote it more carefully. Certain details did not belong in formal reports. That evening, Sokolov sat on an ammunition crate outside the workshop, boots drying near a makeshift stove. His hands were black with oil that no amount of wiping seemed to remove. Nearby, other crews spoke in low voices, replaying their own narrow escapes. No one spoke of heroism. They spoke of engines that had seized, of tracks that had come off under fire, of friends who had not been as lucky. 2 days later, the brigade moved on. The front did not pause for repairs. Sokolov was reassigned temporarily to another crew, another Sherman, another engine with its own temperament. The ravine east of Veliki Krashinsky became just another coordinate passed and forgotten. Weeks later, in a quiet moment between movements, Sokolov saw a brief note pinned to a board near the brigade command post. It summarized an engagement from February 11th. Enemy Panzergrenadier platoon destroyed. 1 StuG 3 and 1 Panzer 4 knocked out. Soviet losses were minimal. No mention of a ravine. No mention of a dead engine. German records, examined long after the war, contained a fragment that may have referred to the same morning. A regimental diary noted unexpected resistance from a supposedly immobilized enemy tank, followed by sudden infantry losses in restricted terrain. The entry ended without analysis. There was no time for it then. Sokolov survived the war. He returned to civilian life thinner, quieter, and less inclined to speak about machines. He worked again with engines, but never in the same way. Those who knew him later remembered that he listened to machines longer than necessary, as if waiting for them to confess something. Historians would later debate the extent to which mechanical improvisation influenced small unit outcomes on the Eastern Front. Some would argue that numbers and doctrine mattered more. Others would point to moments like this one, unrecorded in detail, where survival hinged on a single decision made by a mechanic with frozen hands and no alternatives. What remains uncertain is whether the trap in that ravine was ever fully understood by those on the other side. Did the Panzergrenadiers believe they had been lured deliberately? Or did they think they had simply been unlucky, caught by a machine that refused to die on schedule? There is no definitive answer. Only a damaged engine, a crossed-out line in a logbook, and the knowledge that for a few minutes on a winter morning in Ukraine, a dead Sherman engine dictated the fate of a platoon.